Picture this. For 8 years, my parents made every excuse in the book to keep my husband out of family gatherings. Too crowded, too intimate, not the right vibe. Every holiday became a diplomatic nightmare where I had to choose between the man I loved and the family I grew up with. But last Easter, when my father's heart stopped beating in the middle of our local hospital, guess who was the only person qualified to restart it? Sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door. It performs open heart surgery. Before we jump, back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I spent the first 30 years of my life believing that family love was supposed to be unconditional. Growing up in Millbrook, a town so small that everyone knew your business before you did, the concept of family was everything. The Clearwater clan had deep roots here, 3 generations of successful farmers, respected church members, and people who understood their place in the natural order of things. I was raised to believe that blood meant everything, that family loyalty was sacred, and that outsiders could never truly understand the bonds that held us together. These weren't just values in our household, they were gospel truth, handed down from my grandmother who built our family's reputation from nothing, to my mother who maintained it with military precision, to me and my younger brother David who were expected to carry it forward without question. The Clearwater women were known for their strength, their devotion to tradition, and their ability to maintain harmony in any situation. We hosted the town's Christmas cookie exchange every year, organized the church fundraisers, and our family reunions were legendary events that drew relatives from 3 states. People in Millbrook looked up to us, respected us, and I grew up genuinely proud to carry that legacy. But here's what I learned about family loyalty. It's often just a pretty name for conditional acceptance wrapped in tradition and tied with a bow of expectation. And I learned this lesson the hard way when I fell in love with someone who didn't fit their carefully constructed narrative of who belonged in our family portrait. When I was 24 and fresh out of Iowa State with a degree in elementary education, I had my life mapped out exactly as my parents envisioned. I would teach at Millbrook Elementary, marry someone from a good local family, have children who would attend the same church I grew up in, and the cycle would continue. It was a safe plan, a predictable plan, and for most of my life, it felt like the only plan worth considering. Then I met Alexander Chen during a summer program in Chicago, where I was completing additional certification courses. He was finishing his medical residency at Northwestern, focused and driven in a way that both intimidated and fascinated me. Alex had this quiet confidence that came from years of studying, learning, and pushing himself beyond what anyone expected, from the son of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for his education. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything from teaching methods to medical ethics, from our dreams for the future to our fears about living up to family expectations. He told me about growing up in his parents' restaurant, studying by candlelight during power outages, and working double shifts to pay for school while maintaining a perfect GPA. I told him about Millbrook, about the comfort of knowing your place in the world, and about the weight of carrying your family's reputation everywhere you went. What struck me most about Alex wasn't just his intelligence or his ambition, it was his gentleness. He listened to my stories about small-town life without judgment, asked thoughtful questions about my teaching philosophy, and made me feel like my dreams mattered just as much as his own. In a world where I'd always been defined by my last name and my family's expectations, Alex saw me as Jessica first, Clearwater second. When the summer program ended and I had to return to Millbrook, I thought our connection would fade naturally. Distance has a way of putting things in perspective, and I figured once I was back in my familiar world, this brief glimpse into something different would become just a sweet memory. But Alex had other plans. He called every day, wrote actual letters that arrived in our family mailbox, and even drove the 4 hours from Chicago to Millbrook just to take me to dinner at the only decent restaurant in town. For 3 months, I managed to keep these two worlds separate. Alex would visit, meet my parents briefly, and we'd spend our time exploring the countryside or talking in coffee shops where I was less likely to run into people who knew my entire family history. My parents were polite but distant during these encounters, treating Alex like a temporary distraction rather than someone important in my life. The first real warning sign came during Sunday dinner at my grandmother's house, a weekly tradition that no one missed without a serious emergency. I mentioned that Alex might be transferring to Des Moines General Hospital after completing his residency, which would put him only 2 hours away instead of 4. The conversation literally stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. My grandmother, who had never raised her voice in my presence, set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision and said, "Jessica, dear, I think it's time we had a conversation about your future." What followed was an intervention disguised as family concern, where 3 generations of Clearwater women explained to me why this relationship, while perhaps nice for now, wasn't sustainable for someone with my responsibilities and background. They didn't say anything directly offensive about Alex. They were too well-mannered for that. Instead, they spoke in coded language about compatibility, about the challenges of different backgrounds, and about the importance of preserving family traditions. My mother worried about how an intercultural marriage might affect any future children. My grandmother questioned whether someone from such a different world could truly understand our values. My aunt suggested that I was confusing temporary attraction with long-term compatibility. The subtext was clear. Alex was fine. As a phase, acceptable as a learning experience, but completely inappropriate as a permanent choice. They presented this perspective as wisdom, as protection, as love. And for a brief moment, I almost believed them. After all, these were the women who had raised me, who had guided every major decision in my life, and who had never steered me wrong before. But then I remembered Alex's hands as he talked about his patients, the way his voice changed when he described saving someone's life, and the careful respect he showed everyone from hospital janitors to department heads. I thought about our conversations about building a future together, about combining our different strengths to create something beautiful and meaningful. And I realized that what my family called wisdom was actually fear. Fear of change, fear of difference, and fear of losing control over a narrative they had spent decades perfecting. That night, for the first time in my life, I chose my own truth over their comfort. I told them that Alex wasn't a phase or a mistake. He was the person I wanted to build a life with, and their approval would be appreciated but wasn't required. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in our family, a complete absence of the warmth and support I had grown up taking for granted. Looking back now, I can see that this moment changed everything between us. Not just because I disagreed with them, but because I had broken an unspoken rule about how decisions were made in our family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had chosen an individual path over collective wisdom, personal happiness over family harmony, and love over tradition. In their minds, this wasn't just about Alex. It was about whether I was still the daughter they had raised or someone they no longer recognized. The months that followed were a masterclass in passive-aggressive disapproval. My parents remained civil but distant, treating my relationship like a temporary delusion that would eventually run its course. They stopped asking about my weekend plans, stopped including Alex in casual invitations, and developed a remarkable talent for discussing family events in ways that somehow never quite included specific dates or times. When Alex finally proposed on Christmas Eve, presenting me with his grandmother's ring and a speech about building bridges between different worlds, I was simultaneously the happiest and most terrified I had ever been. Happy because I knew with Absolute certainty that I was making the right choice. Terrified because I knew that choice would test every relationship I had ever counted on. The engagement announcement in the Millbrook Gazette should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like a declaration of war, with my family on one side and my future on the other. And as I would learn over the following years, some wars don't end with dramatic battles. They drag on through small battles, subtle slights, and the slow erosion of what you thought were unshakable bonds. But in that moment, holding Alex's hand and planning our future together, I believed that love would eventually win. I believed that my family would come around once they got to know Alex better, once they saw how happy he made me, once they understood that different didn't mean wrong. I had no idea how long it would take for them to learn that lesson, or what it would cost all of us before they did. Wedding planning should have been one of the happiest times of my life. Instead, it became a 9-month negotiation where every decision felt like a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen. My mother had very specific ideas about what a proper Clearwater wedding should look like, and most of those ideas seemed designed to minimize Alex's presence in what was supposed to be our celebration. The guest list became our first major battleground. Mom insisted that we needed to invite everyone who had ever attended a Clearwater family function, which meant nearly half the town of Millbrook. When I pointed out that this would make the wedding enormous and expensive, she reminded me that our family had a reputation to maintain and that people would expect to be included. But when Alex wanted to invite his extended family from California and his medical school friends from Chicago, suddenly we needed to keep things manageable and remember our budget. The venue selection process revealed even more about my family's priorities. Mom had already reserved the Millbrook Country Club without consulting us, explaining that it was where all the important weddings happened and that anything else would look strange to people. When Alex suggested we might want to consider venues in Des Moines or Cedar Rapids that could better accommodate both our families, my father intervened with concerns about the expense and inconvenience for our local guests. What bothered me most wasn't just the assumption that their preferences automatically took priority. It was the way they framed every disagreement as being about practical concerns rather than acknowledging their real objections. They never said they didn't want Alex's family to feel comfortable, but somehow every decision that would have made his loved ones feel welcome was deemed too complicated, too expensive, or too different from how we've always done things. The catering menu became another source of tension. The country club had a standard package that included prime rib, chicken breast, and the same sides they had served at every wedding for the past 20 years. Alex's family had offered to contribute some traditional dishes that would represent his heritage and give the reception a more personal touch. My grandmother's response was diplomatic but firm. "Oh, that's very thoughtful, dear. But we wouldn't want to confuse people or make them uncomfortable with unfamiliar foods." I watched Alex's face during that conversation, saw the way he absorbed the rejection with practiced grace, and realized this was probably not his first experience with having his culture treated as something potentially offensive to others. The worst part was that my grandmother genuinely believed she was being considerate, protecting our guests from having to navigate foods they might not recognize. It never occurred to her that she was actually protecting them from learning something new or that her comfort was being prioritized over his family's inclusion. The music selection followed the same pattern. The country club had a preferred list of DJs who specialized in what my mother called appropriate reception music, classic rock, country, and dance hits that would appeal to our local crowd. When Alex mentioned that his cousins were professional musicians who had offered to perform during the ceremony or reception, the response was enthusiastic until my parents learned that they played traditional Chinese instruments. Suddenly, there were concerns about acoustics, about whether the country club could accommodate different equipment needs, and about whether that type of music would really fit the vibe we were going for. My mother suggested that maybe Alex's cousins could play during the rehearsal dinner instead, which would be more intimate and special. The subtext was clear. Their music was welcome, as long as it stayed contained to a smaller, less visible part of our celebration. Photography became another minefield. The photographer my parents hired was a family friend who had captured every major Clearwater event for decades. She was talented and professional, but her style was very traditional. Formal posed shots, standard family groupings, and the same progression of moments she had documented at countless local weddings. When Alex suggested we might also want to incorporate some candid storytelling photography that could capture the blend of our different backgrounds and traditions, my mother worried that having two photographers might be confusing and create conflicts. What she really meant was that she didn't want any documentation that emphasized the cultural differences she was working so hard to minimize. The photos she envisioned would tell the story of Jessica Clearwater marrying a nice young man, with any details that marked this as an intercultural union carefully edited out or downplayed. The most painful example came during our engagement party planning. My parents wanted to host an elegant cocktail reception at our family home, which had enough space and would allow them to control every detail. They spent weeks planning the menu, the decorations, and the guest list, creating an event that would properly announce our engagement to the Millbrook community. Alex's parents drove in from Chicago for the party, bringing beautiful flowers and a traditional tea ceremony set as gifts for my family. They had researched Iowa customs online and asked thoughtful questions about local traditions, genuinely trying to bridge the gap between our different worlds. My parents accepted their gifts graciously, but seemed uncomfortable with the reciprocal expectations these gestures created. During the party itself, I watched my family navigate the evening with careful politeness. They introduced Alex's parents to their friends with phrases like "Alex's lovely family from Chicago," and guided conversations towards safe topics like the weather, travel, and work. But whenever Alex's mother tried to share stories about their family traditions or asked about incorporating some of their customs into the wedding, the responses became vague and non-committal. The clearest example came when Alex's father, a retired engineer who had built a successful consulting business, offered to host a traditional Chinese tea ceremony as part of our wedding weekend. He explained that it was a way to honor both families and show respect for the joining of two households. My grandmother smiled warmly and said it sounded very interesting, but wondered if there would be time in our already packed schedule for additional events. Later that evening, I overheard my mother on the phone with my aunt, processing the evening's events. "They're very nice people," she said, "but I think they have different expectations about how involved they should be in the planning. We need to be careful not to let things get too complicated or confusing for our guests." That conversation crystallized something I had been struggling to understand. My family wasn't being intentionally cruel or discriminatory. In their minds, they were being protective and practical. They genuinely believed they were helping us avoid potential problems and ensuring our wedding would be successful by their community's standards. But their definition of success required making Alex and his family conform to expectations rather than creating space for difference. The breaking point came during a family dinner at my grandparents' house, a weekly tradition that had been the cornerstone of my childhood. Alex had been invited to these dinners sporadically since our engagement, usually when my mother remembered to mention them in advance. On this particular evening, my grandfather decided to discuss wedding logistics in detail. He had opinions about everything from the ceremony length to the reception timeline, delivered with the authority of someone who had hosted 5 daughters' weddings and knew how these things should be done. When Alex tentatively suggested that his family might appreciate having some elements of the ceremony explained in both English and Mandarin, since his grandparents spoke limited English, my grandfather's response was swift and definitive. "Now, son," he said, using the patronizing tone he usually reserved for correcting children, "we want to make sure everyone feels comfortable, but we also can't make things so complicated that people get confused or restless. A wedding ceremony should be beautiful and meaningful, but it also needs to move along at a good pace." Alex nodded politely and didn't push back, but I could see the way he retreated into himself for the rest of the evening. After dinner, as we walked to his car, he was quieter than usual. When I asked what he was thinking, he chose his words carefully. "Your family isn't wrong about wanting the ceremony to flow smoothly," he said. "But I'm starting to wonder if there's any part of this wedding that will actually reflect both of us, or if I'm just supposed to be grateful for being included in yours." That question haunted me for weeks. I started paying closer attention to the wedding we were planning and realized that Alex was right. Every decision had been filtered through my family's comfort level, their aesthetic preferences, and their vision of what our community would expect. We weren't planning a celebration that honored both our backgrounds. We were planning a traditional Clearwater wedding with a groom who happened to be Chinese American. The pattern extended beyond wedding planning into our everyday interactions. During family gatherings, Alex was treated with polite courtesy, but never quite included in the easy familiarity that marked family relationships. Conversations would pause when he entered a room, restart on safer topics, and avoid the kind of casual teasing or inside jokes that typically drew people into the family circle. My mother developed a habit of asking me privately how Alex was, doing with various wedding decisions as if his opinions were something to be managed rather than genuinely considered. She would suggest that maybe certain traditions might be too much for him to understand, or that we should keep things simple to avoid overwhelming him with our family's way of doing things. The irony was that Alex was actually more patient and accommodating than most people would have been in his situation. He attended every event he was invited to, participated in every tradition he was included in, and never complained about the numerous ways his own preferences were being overruled or ignored. But I could see the emotional cost of constantly adapting himself to fit into spaces that weren't designed to welcome him fully. By the time we were 3 months away from the wedding, I realized that my family had successfully created a celebration that would look perfect to their community, while systematically erasing anything that might mark it as different from any other Clearwater family wedding. And somehow, they had managed to do this while maintaining the illusion that they were being inclusive and welcoming to Alex and his family. The first time I heard my mother describe Alex as challenging, I thought I had misunderstood. We were at the grocery store, running into Mrs. Patterson, who had taught my Sunday school class for 15 years. She asked about wedding planning with the kind of enthusiastic interest that small-town women reserve for major family events. "Oh, it's going wonderfully," my mother said with practiced brightness. "Jessica has such good taste, and we're so excited." Of course, planning a wedding when the groom has such different expectations can be challenging, but we're working through it all. Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically, as if navigating cultural differences was some kind of unfortunate obstacle rather than an opportunity to create something beautiful and unique. The conversation continued with my mother positioning herself as the patient mentor, helping her naive daughter navigate the complexities of marrying outside her background. What struck me most was how skillfully my mother had reframed the situation. Instead of acknowledging that Alex's family had been consistently excluded from meaningful participation in our wedding planning, she presented herself as graciously accommodating unreasonable demands. The challenges she referenced were actually instances where Alex had politely requested basic inclusion, like having his family's dietary restrictions considered or incorporating small cultural elements into our ceremony. Over the following weeks, I started noticing this pattern everywhere. At church, my mother would update concerned friends about how complicated wedding planning had become, always with a long-suffering smile that suggested she was nobly bearing a difficult burden. She developed a repertoire of phrases that sounded supportive on the surface but carried clear subtext about who was being reasonable and who was being demanding. We want Alex to feel comfortable, of course, but some of his family's ideas are quite elaborate. Jessica is trying so hard to make everyone happy, but you know how these things can get when there are such different expectations. We're learning so much about different customs, though it does make everything more complicated than we're used to. Each statement was technically true, but presented in a way that cast Alex's family as the source of unnecessary complications. My mother had perfected the art of expressing tolerance while simultaneously positioning that tolerance as a generous concession rather than a basic requirement for welcoming someone into the family. The most insidious part was how these conversations always took place without Alex present, creating a narrative about him and his family that they never had the opportunity to address or correct. By the time Alex would meet these same community members at church events or local gatherings, they already had a framework for understanding him as someone whose presence created challenges for our family. My younger brother David picked up on these subtle cues and began echoing them in his own conversations. During a family barbecue, I overheard him explaining to our cousin why the wedding had been moved to a larger venue. Jessica's fiancé's family is really into big celebrations, so now we have to invite like twice as many people and spend way more money. This was a complete misrepresentation of what had actually happened. The venue change occurred because my parents had insisted on inviting their extensive network of family friends and business associates, expanding our original guest list from 60 people to nearly 200. Alex's family had actually advocated for a smaller, more intimate celebration, but David had somehow absorbed the message that Alex's cultural background was the source of any wedding-related stress or expense. When I tried to correct David's misunderstanding, he looked genuinely confused. But Mom said that Alex's family has really specific requirements about food and music and stuff, he protested. She said you're trying really hard to make them happy, but it's making everything super complicated. I realized then that my family had created an entire alternative version of our wedding planning experience, one where they were the patient victims of unreasonable cultural demands rather than the primary decision-makers who had systematically excluded Alex's input. This narrative was so pervasive and consistently reinforced that even David, who generally liked Alex and had no personal investment in undermining him, had internalized it completely. The labeling campaign extended beyond wedding planning into broader characterizations of Alex's personality and behavior. My mother developed a talent for describing his positive qualities in ways that also highlighted his differences as potential problems. Alex is so dedicated to his work, she would say, though sometimes I worry that doctors don't really understand how to balance career and family life. He's very intelligent, of course, but you know how academic types can be. Sometimes they overthink things that should be simple. Alex has such strong opinions about everything, which I suppose comes from his professional training, but it can make casual conversations quite intense. These descriptions were crafted to sound like compliments while actually seeding doubts about Alex's suitability as a family member. My mother was essentially inoculating her social circle against being too impressed by Alex's accomplishments or too welcoming of his perspectives. The most damaging aspect of this labeling campaign was how it affected my own perception of normal relationship dynamics. When Alex would express preferences about our shared life, wanting to live closer to his work, hoping to travel to visit his extended family, or planning to maintain certain cultural traditions in our future home, I started to wonder if these requests were reasonable or if they represented the challenging behavior my mother had warned people about. I found myself apologizing for Alex's perfectly normal desire to have input into major decisions, as if wanting equal partnership in our relationship was somehow demanding or difficult. When he suggested we might want to live in a larger city after getting married, where there would be better professional opportunities for both of us and more cultural diversity, I presented this idea to my family as if I was asking them to accept some kind of unreasonable hardship. The most painful example occurred during our engagement photos. Alex had requested that we take some pictures at locations that reflected both our backgrounds, perhaps some at the country club where our reception would be held, but also some in settings that represented his heritage or our shared interests. The photographer, who was a family friend, seemed confused by this request. "Well, that's interesting," she said, "but I think we want to focus on locations that will look timeless and classic in your wedding album. You don't want pictures that might seem dated or out of place in a few years. When I relayed this conversation to my mother, her response revealed how thoroughly she had internalized the idea that Alex's cultural background was something to be managed rather than celebrated. "Oh, honey," she said with a sympathetic sigh. "I think Alex is having trouble understanding that wedding photos are really about documenting this moment in your family's history. Of course he wants to feel represented, but you don't want your album to look like a cultural studies project." The assumption underlying her comment was that our family history was separate from and more important than anything Alex might bring to it. In her mind, Alex was joining our story rather than us creating a new story together, and any evidence of that joining should be minimized to maintain the aesthetic coherence of our family narrative. By the time our wedding day arrived, this labeling campaign had been so successful that many of our guests had a preformed understanding of Alex as someone whose presence had complicated what should have been a simple, traditional celebration. They were prepared to be politely tolerant of any cultural elements that might appear, viewing them as accommodations we were making rather than meaningful aspects of our shared identity. During the reception, I watched people navigate interactions with Alex's family with the kind of careful courtesy usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. Friendly but formal, interested but cautious, welcoming but clearly marking the boundaries of that welcome. Alex's parents, who had been so excited to blend their family with mine, found themselves in the position of gracious guests rather than equal partners in celebrating their son's marriage. The saddest part was that by this point, even I had started to see our cultural differences through my family's lens. Instead of appreciating the richness that Alex's background brought to our relationship, I had learned to view it as something that required careful management to avoid overwhelming or confusing the people around us. Our wedding was beautiful and well-attended, exactly the kind of celebration that would enhance the Clearwater family reputation in Millbrook. But it wasn't really our wedding, it was their wedding, with Alex and me as the featured performers in a story that had been written long before we arrived. The first holidays as a married couple taught me that wedding planning had only been the opening act. Christmas arrived with a carefully orchestrated series of events that somehow managed to include Alex, while making it clear that his presence was being tolerated rather than celebrated. Christmas Eve had always been sacred in the Clearwater family. We would gather at my grandparents' farmhouse for dinner, followed by the traditional gift exchange and midnight church service. The evening had a specific rhythm developed over decades. Everyone arrived by 5 o'clock, dinner was served at 6 sharp, gifts were opened in order of age starting with the youngest children, and we left for church at 11:30 to ensure good seats for the service. Alex and I arrived precisely on time, bearing the gifts we had carefully selected for each family member and a traditional Chinese New Year decoration that Alex had hoped to share as a way of introducing his family's holiday traditions. My grandmother accepted the decoration with polite appreciation, but immediately set it aside with the other gifts, making it clear that it wouldn't be displayed with the familiar Christmas decorations that had been arranged with museum-like precision throughout the house. During dinner, the conversation flowed around Alex rather than including him. Family members caught up on local news, discussed mutual friends, and shared inside jokes from previous holidays, while Alex listened politely and attempted to contribute when opportunities arose. When he tried to share a funny story about the medical residency holiday party he had attended the week before, the response was lukewarm. Brief laughter followed by someone quickly redirecting the conversation back to more familiar territory. The gift exchange revealed the depth of planning that had gone into managing Alex's inclusion. Everyone had received roughly equivalent presents, but the gifts for Alex were notably generic: a nice sweater in a standard color, a coffee table book about Iowa history, items that were thoughtful enough to avoid being insulting but impersonal. Enough to avoid suggesting any real relationship or understanding of his interests. Meanwhile, my gifts were deeply personal and clearly expensive. Jewelry that had been in the family for generations, a handmade quilt from my grandmother, items that marked my continued membership in the family's inner circle. The message was subtle but unmistakable. I remained fully included while Alex occupied a provisional status that might be revoked at any time. The church service presented its own challenges. Our family had occupied the same pew for as long as anyone could remember, a coveted location near the front that reflected our standing in the congregation. Adding Alex to this group meant adjusting seating arrangements that had been stable for years, and I could feel the subtle resistance to this change in the way family members positioned themselves. During the service, when Pastor Williams invited families to introduce visitors and newcomers, my grandfather stood to acknowledge Alex's presence. "We're pleased to have Jessica's husband Alex joining us tonight," he announced, using phrasing that positioned Alex as my addition to the family rather than a new family member in his own right. The weeks between Christmas and New Year's brought a series of similar events, family dinners, game nights, informal gatherings that all followed the same pattern of polite inclusion coupled with careful boundary maintenance. Alex was invited to these events but never consulted about scheduling, never asked about his preferences for activities, and never given opportunities to contribute to planning or hosting. New Year's Eve traditionally involved a large party at my parents' house, with family and close friends gathering to celebrate together. This year, my mother mentioned that they were keeping things smaller and more intimate, which apparently meant that Alex's work colleagues and friends weren't welcome, even though they had been hoping to introduce him to more people in the community. When I asked if we could bring Dr. Martinez, Alex's closest colleague who had become a good friend to both of us, my mother explained that they were trying to maintain the family feel of the evening, and that adding too many outsiders might change the dynamic they were hoping to achieve. The implication was clear. Alex had been granted admission to family events, but his social circle remained separate and wasn't welcome to integrate with ours. This effectively prevented him from developing the kind of community connections that might have made him feel more rooted in Millbrook or given him allies outside of my immediate family. Spring brought engagement in community activities, and here the patterns of exclusion became even more apparent. My family was heavily involved in organizing the annual Millbrook Heritage Festival, a major event that brought together local families to celebrate the town's agricultural history. Planning meetings were held at our house, committee assignments were distributed among family members, and preparations dominated our conversations for months. Alex expressed interest in participating and offered his help with various aspects of the festival planning. He had experience with event organization from medical conferences and genuinely wanted to contribute to the community we were now part of. My mother's response was enthusiastic but vague. "That's so thoughtful of you, Alex. Let us see how things develop and where we might need extra help." As planning progressed, it became clear that extra help meant manual labor rather than decision-making roles. Alex was invited to help set up tents and move tables, but wasn't included in the creative planning sessions where themes were chosen, entertainment was selected, and vendor relationships were managed. The festival committee was essentially an extension of our extended family network, and Alex wasn't granted access to these informal power structures. During the festival itself, I watched Alex navigate his assigned role with grace and patience, helping with logistics while observing the easy familiarity that marked relationships between longtime community members. He was working hard to contribute, but remained clearly outside the inner circle of people who knew each other's histories, shared common references, and operated with the efficiency that comes from years of collaboration. The most telling moment came during the festival's closing ceremony, when my grandfather traditionally thanked the key organizers and their families for their contributions. Each major volunteer was recognized along with their spouse and children, celebrating the family effort that made the event possible. When Alex's name wasn't mentioned, despite his significant contributions, I realized that his work had been appreciated, but not necessarily attributed to him personally. Summer brought wedding invitations from other young couples in our social circle, And these events became exercises in social navigation that revealed how completely Alex had been categorized as an outsider despite our marriage. At each wedding, we were seated with other couples but never positioned at the tables reserved for family friends or longtime community members. During these receptions, I would watch Alex make conversation with people he had met multiple times before, reintroducing himself and repeating basic biographical information because none of these relationships had progressed beyond polite acquaintance. Meanwhile, I moved easily through rooms full of people who had known me since childhood, picking up conversations that had been interrupted at previous gatherings, sharing updates about mutual friends, and participating in the social continuity that made these events meaningful for longtime community members. The invitations themselves told a story about how our marriage was perceived by the broader community. While I was invited to bridal showers, bachelor parties, and intimate pre-wedding gatherings, Alex wasn't included in the corresponding events for grooms. These omissions weren't necessarily intentional slights, but they reflected the reality that Alex hadn't been integrated into the social networks that organized these celebrations. Fall brought hunting season, a major social event for men in our community that involved weeks of preparation, group planning, and shared expeditions that strengthened relationships among participants. Alex had never hunted but expressed interest in learning, seeing it as an opportunity to connect with my father, brother, and uncles on shared ground. My father's response was diplomatically discouraging. "Hunting really requires years of experience to do safely, Alex. Maybe it would be better if you waited until you've had more time to learn the basics before joining a group expedition." This effectively excluded Alex from one of the primary ways that men in our community bonded with each other, while positioning that exclusion as concern for his safety, rather than reluctance to include him. The hunting trips proceeded without him, while I listened to my father and brother share stories about their experiences, building memories and relationships that Alex would never be part of. By our first wedding anniversary, the patterns of exclusion had become so normalized that I had stopped noticing them as deliberate choices. Alex had been granted a kind of honorary membership in our family that allowed him to attend events and participate in activities, but never to influence decisions, shape traditions, or assume the kind of ownership that marked real belonging. We had created a comfortable routine where Alex's presence was accommodated, but his absence wouldn't have significantly affected anyone's experience. He had become a polite addition to family gatherings rather than an integral part of them. Someone whose opinions were solicited out of courtesy, but whose preferences didn't meaningfully influence outcomes. The saddest part was that Alex had adapted to these limitations with remarkable grace, finding ways to contribute without overstepping the invisible boundaries that had been established around his participation. He had learned to be grateful for inclusion rather than expecting equality, to appreciate tolerance rather than demanding acceptance. Looking back, I can see that this first year of marriage established the framework that would define Alex's relationship with my family for years to come. He would always be Jessica's husband rather than a family member in his own right, always a guest rather than a host, always someone whose presence required special accommodation rather than someone whose absence would create a meaningful void. And somehow, we had all learned to treat this arrangement as normal, even generous, rather than recognizing it as a form of systematic exclusion that preserved the comfort of longtime family members at the expense of genuine inclusion for the newest one. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Alex was working a late shift at the hospital. I was grading papers at our kitchen table when my Aunt Linda called, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when delivering information she knew would be difficult to hear. "Jessica, honey," she began. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I feel like I need to share something with you, as someone who loves you and wants what's best for your marriage." The conversation she referenced had been a casual chat about the challenges of adjusting to married life, the kind of discussion I thought I was having with a trusted family member who understood the complexities of blending different backgrounds and expectations. Aunt Linda had always been my favorite relative, funny, direct, and seemingly more open-minded than some of our more traditional family members. "I've been watching Alex try to fit in with our family," she continued. "And I can see how hard he's working. But Jessica, I'm worried that you're asking too much of everyone. It's not fair to expect our whole family to change the way we do things just to accommodate his preferences." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I processed what she was actually saying. Over the past year, I had confided in Linda about my frustrations with family dynamics, sharing my concerns that Alex sometimes felt excluded from gatherings and decision-making processes. I had thought she was listening with empathy and understanding, but apparently she had been cataloging my complaints as evidence of unreasonable expectations. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what she meant. "Well, like the Christmas decorations issue," she said, referring to Alex's gentle suggestion that we might incorporate some of his family's holiday traditions into our celebrations. "And the wedding planning situation, where Alex's family wanted to change so many things about how we usually handle these events. I think Alex is a lovely person, but he needs to understand that when you marry into a family, you adapt to their way of doing things, not the other way around." The betrayal wasn't just in her words. It was in the realization that every private conversation I had shared with Linda had been reinterpreted through a lens that positioned my family as the generous victims of unreasonable demands. She had taken my efforts to advocate for Alex's inclusion and transformed them into evidence that I was being manipulated by someone who didn't understand appropriate boundaries. "Linda," I said slowly, "Alex has never asked anyone to change family traditions. He's only suggested that we might create some new traditions that include both our backgrounds." "Oh, honey," she replied with the patient tone adults use with naive children, "I think you're being too generous in your interpretation. Alex may not realize what he's asking for, but every time he suggests adding something new or doing things differently, he's essentially saying that our way isn't good enough." This conversation revealed how thoroughly my family had reframed every interaction with Alex to support their narrative of generous tolerance in the face of inappropriate demands. Linda genuinely believed she was protecting me from someone who was taking advantage of my loving nature and pushing boundaries that should remain fixed. The worst part was that Linda wasn't wrong about Alex making suggestions for inclusion. He had politely requested opportunities to share his background and integrate his family's traditions with ours. But she had interpreted these requests as entitled demands rather than reasonable hopes for belonging, viewing his desire for mutual cultural exchange as evidence of selfishness rather than partnership. "I think you need to have a serious conversation with Alex about expectations," Linda concluded. "Help him understand that marriage is about joining a family, not forcing that family to accommodate every difference." After hanging up, I sat in our quiet kitchen trying to process what had just happened. Linda had positioned herself as my ally and protector while actually undermining the foundation of my marriage. She had taken my private struggles with family dynamics and used them as ammunition to support the very exclusion patterns I had been trying to address. Over the following days, I began to notice similar dynamics in other relationships I had counted on for support. My college roommate Sarah, who had seemed enthusiastic about our intercultural marriage during the wedding planning, made comments that revealed her true feelings about the challenges of such relationships. "I really admire how patient you are with all the cultural stuff," she said during a coffee date. "I don't think I could handle having to constantly explain and accommodate different expectations. It must be exhausting sometimes." Sarah's comment revealed that she viewed Alex's cultural background as a burden I was nobly bearing, rather than a gift that enriched our relationship. She had apparently been watching our marriage with sympathy for the difficulties I must be facing rather than joy for the beautiful blending we were creating. When I tried to explain that I didn't experience Alex's heritage as something requiring accommodation, but rather as an opportunity to learn and grow, Sarah's response was telling. "Well, of course you have to say that. But privately, between us, it must be hard when your husband's family has such different expectations about everything." The assumption underlying her perspective was that healthy marriages required cultural similarity and that any differences represented obstacles to overcome rather than opportunities to embrace. Sarah had decided that my positive statements about intercultural marriage were public relations rather than genuine feelings, and she was offering me permission to admit the truth about how difficult my situation really was. The pattern extended to my professional relationships as well. At school, my principal, Mrs. Anderson, had initially been supportive and curious about Alex's medical career, asking thoughtful questions about his work and expressing interest in his perspectives on healthcare issues. But over time, her attitude shifted to something more like concerned supervision. "How are you managing everything at home?" she asked during a routine evaluation meeting. "I know it can be challenging when both spouses have demanding careers, especially when there are cultural differences to navigate as well." Mrs. Anderson's question seemed innocent enough, but it revealed her assumption that Alex's presence in my life had complicated my professional effectiveness. She was essentially checking to make sure that my marriage wasn't interfering with my teaching responsibilities, treating my cultural differences as a potential workplace liability. When I assured her that my home life was stable and supportive, she nodded with the expression of someone who wasn't entirely convinced, but appreciated my professionalism in maintaining appropriate boundaries. The conversation left me feeling like my marriage had been categorized as a risk factor, requiring ongoing monitoring rather than a source of strength and stability. The most painful betrayal came from my childhood friend Emma, who had been my maid of honor, and had seemed genuinely excited about Alex joining our social circle. Emma had always been adventurous and open-minded, traveling extensively and expressing interest in different cultures and perspectives. During a girls' night out, several months after our wedding, Emma made a comment that revealed how she really felt about the changes in our friendship dynamic since my marriage. "I miss how easy things used to be between us," she said after a few drinks had loosened her tongue. "Now I feel like I have to be so careful about what I say because Alex might not understand our humor or might take things the wrong way." When I asked what she meant, Emma explained that she felt uncomfortable making the kind of casual jokes and references that had always characterized our friendship because she wasn't sure how Alex would react to humor that might not translate across cultural differences. Like, "Remember how we used to make fun of everything and everyone?" she continued. "Now I feel like I have to think about whether something might be offensive or confusing to Alex before I say it." The irony was that Alex had never expressed discomfort with our group's humor or asked anyone to modify their communication style around him. Emma had decided independently that his presence required her to censor herself, and she resented the self-imposed restrictions rather than questioning whether they were actually necessary. "Emma," I said, "Alex has never asked you to change how you talk or act around him. He enjoys your sense of humor and has never seemed uncomfortable with our conversations." "Maybe not directly," she replied, "but you can tell when someone doesn't really get the dynamic of a group, and I don't want to be the person who accidentally says something inappropriate." Emma's response revealed that she had been monitoring Alex's reactions to determine his comfort level, rather than simply including him naturally in our interactions. She had turned his presence into a performance where she had to constantly evaluate her words and behavior, creating exactly the kind of artificial dynamic that prevented genuine relationship building. The cumulative effect of these conversations was devastating. People I had counted on for support and understanding had revealed themselves to be polite observers who viewed my marriage as a social experiment, rather than allies who celebrated the beautiful relationship Alex and I had built together. Even worse, many of these same people positioned themselves as concerned friends who were looking out for my best interests by pointing out the challenges and difficulties they perceived in my situation. They offered sympathy for problems I wasn't experiencing and advice for managing conflicts that existed primarily in their own discomfort with difference. The most insidious aspect was how these conversations planted seeds of doubt about my own perceptions and experiences. When multiple people expressed concern about the same issues, It became tempting to wonder if I was being naive or defensive. In my assessment of our family dynamics, were the challenges Alex faced with my family really as insignificant as I wanted to believe? The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering, exactly the kind of formal announcement that my family used for their most important celebrations. My brother David was getting married to Michelle Roberts, a local girl whose family owned the largest grain operation in 3 counties. The wedding would be held at the Millbrook Country Club, followed by a reception that promised to be the social event of the season. I opened the envelope with genuine excitement, imagining Alex and me celebrating this milestone with our family, dancing at the reception, and finally having an opportunity for Alex to be included in a major family celebration where we weren't the center of attention. The engagement had been announced 6 months earlier, and I had been looking forward to participating in wedding planning and pre-celebration events as an established married couple, rather than the newcomers we had been during our own wedding. The invitation was beautiful, listing all the traditional details about ceremony location, reception venue, and dress code expectations. But as I read through the carefully scripted text, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a note that read, "Due to venue limitations, this celebration will be limited to immediate family members only." I read the words 3 times before their meaning fully registered. After 5 years of marriage, Alex was still not considered immediate family. Despite being legally connected to the Clearwater family through our marriage, despite attending countless family gatherings and contributing to family events, despite his efforts to build relationships, with each family member individually, he had been categorized as someone whose presence was optional rather than essential. I called my mother immediately, hoping there had been some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Surely the immediate family-only designation was meant to exclude distant cousins and family friends, not the spouses of core family members. "Oh, Jessica," my mother said when I explained my confusion. "I was hoping you would understand without us having to explain the whole situation. The Roberts family has very specific ideas about wedding celebrations, and they've requested that we keep the guest list extremely tight. David and Michelle are trying to create a very intimate atmosphere." "But Mom," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "Alex is immediate family. He's my husband. How can David's wedding be immediate family only if it doesn't include his brother-in-law?" There was a long pause before my mother responded, and when she spoke, her tone carried the patient exasperation she used when explaining obvious things to stubborn children. "Honey, you know we love Alex dearly, but this isn't really about our family preferences. The Roberts family is hosting the rehearsal dinner, and they've made it clear that they want to keep things very traditional and simple. Including spouses who aren't blood relatives would mean expanding the guest list significantly, and that's just not the vision they have for their celebration." The explanation was so carefully crafted that it took me several moments to identify all the layers of exclusion it contained. First, Alex was being reclassified as spouse who isn't a blood relative, rather than family member, suggesting that marriage created only provisional membership that could be revoked when convenient. Second, the decision was being attributed to the Roberts family, allowing my family to position themselves as sympathetic victims of someone else's restrictive policies. Third, including Alex was being framed as an unreasonable expansion rather than basic recognition of existing family relationships. "What about Uncle Frank's wife?" I asked, referring to my father's brother who had married his second wife 3 years earlier. "She's not a blood relative either. Is she invited?" "Well, that's different," my mother replied quickly. "Barbara has been part of our extended family network for years now, and the Roberts family knows her well. They wouldn't want to exclude someone who's become such an integral part of our family gatherings." The double standard was breathtaking in its clarity. Barbara, who had joined our family 2 years after Alex, was considered integral while Alex remained optional. The difference wasn't length of membership or contribution to family events. It was something else entirely that my mother couldn't articulate directly, but that we both understood perfectly. "I don't think I can attend David's wedding without my husband," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Oh, Jessica, please don't be dramatic about this," my mother replied with audible frustration. "This is your brother's wedding day. You can't possibly miss such an important family celebration because of something so small. Alex will understand. He's always been reasonable about these kinds of situations." The phrase, "something so small," revealed everything about how my family viewed Alex's exclusion. What felt to me like a fundamental rejection of our marriage was being characterized as a minor logistical inconvenience that any reasonable person would accept without complaint. "And besides," my mother continued, "this might actually be a blessing in disguise. You'll be able to focus completely on supporting David and Michelle without having to worry about making sure Alex is comfortable or included in all the family conversations." This final comment crystallized something I had been struggling to understand for years. My family genuinely believed they were doing me a favor by excluding Alex from family events. In their minds, his presence created additional work for me, social and emotional labor required to bridge the gap between his background and their expectations. They had convinced themselves that I would be relieved to attend family gatherings without the burden of managing his inclusion. The conversation ended with my mother expressing confidence that I would do the right thing and attend the wedding, despite my concerns. She suggested that Alex and I could celebrate with David and Michelle separately, perhaps taking them to dinner after they returned from their honeymoon. This alternative was presented as a generous compromise rather than a clear indication that Alex's relationship with my brother was considered secondary to family relationships by birth. That evening, when Alex came home from the hospital, I showed him the invitation and explained the situation. I watched his face as he processed the information, noting the careful way he controlled his expression to avoid revealing the hurt I knew he was feeling. "It's their wedding," he said finally. "They have the right to celebrate however they want." His response was so measured and diplomatic that it broke my heart. Alex had learned to protect himself from family rejection by maintaining emotional distance and accepting exclusion as normal, rather than fighting for inclusion that might never come. "Alex," I said, "this isn't about their right to make decisions about their wedding. This is about my family's refusal to recognize you as a full family member after 5 years of marriage." "I know," he replied quietly. "But what's the alternative? You can't boycott your brother's wedding because of me. That would just create more problems and probably wouldn't change anything anyway." The resignation in his voice was devastating. Alex had essentially given up on ever being fully accepted by my family and had adapted to a permanent status as an outsider whose presence was tolerated when convenient and excluded when it wasn't. "Maybe this is just how it's going to be," he continued. "Maybe I need to stop expecting things to change and just accept that I'll always be somewhat separate from your family relationships." The conversation continued late into the night, with both of us trying to find a path forward that wouldn't require choosing between family loyalty and marital solidarity. Alex insisted that I should attend the wedding and maintain my relationship with David, while I struggled with the implications of participating in an event that explicitly excluded my husband. By morning, we had reached a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed like the least damaging option available. I would attend the wedding ceremony but skip the reception, allowing me to witness David's marriage while avoiding the extended celebration that would highlight Alex's absence. Alex would spend the day working extra shifts at the hospital, keeping himself busy rather than sitting at home thinking about the family gathering he wasn't welcome to attend. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with uncomfortable conversations as family members learned about our modified participation. Some relatives expressed surprise that Alex wouldn't be attending, suggesting they hadn't been fully informed about the immediate family-only policy. Others seemed relieved that the celebration would remain within comfortable boundaries without the complications that cultural differences might introduce. My grandmother, who had always been the family's emotional center, pulled me aside during a pre-wedding gathering to share her perspective on the situation. "Jessica, dear," she said, "I want you to know that I think Alex is a wonderful young man, and I'm sorry he can't be with us for David's special day. But I also want you to understand that these kinds of decisions aren't personal. They're about maintaining family traditions and ensuring that everyone feels comfortable." Her comment revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped my family's approach to Alex's inclusion from the beginning. They genuinely believed that excluding him was a neutral decision based on practical considerations rather than a personal rejection based on cultural prejudice. They had convinced themselves that their comfort was more important than his belonging, and that prioritizing their preferences was somehow fair and reasonable. The wedding day itself was emotionally complex in ways I hadn't anticipated. David looked handsome and happy, Michelle was radiant, and the ceremony was beautiful and meaningful. Being present for my brother's marriage felt important and right, confirming my decision to attend despite the circumstances. But throughout the celebration, I was acutely aware of Alex's absence in ways that went beyond missing his company. During family photos, there was an obvious gap where he should have been standing. When relatives asked about him, I had to explain repeatedly why my husband wasn't present at my brother's wedding, each conversation highlighting the abnormality of the situation. The reception was the hardest part to miss. Through the country club windows, I could see my family celebrating together, sharing toasts and dancing to music that had marked important moments throughout our shared history. I drove home knowing that memories were being created that Alex and I would never be part of, traditions being reinforced that would continue to exclude us. When I arrived home, Alex was waiting with takeout from our favorite restaurant and a bottle of wine. He had prepared a quiet celebration for just the two of us, acknowledging the significance of the day while creating our own alternative to the family gathering we couldn't attend together. "How was it?" he asked as we sat down to eat. "Beautiful," I replied honestly, "and heartbreaking." We talked through the day's events, with Alex listening carefully as I described the ceremony and shared updates about relatives he had come to know over the years. His questions revealed how much he cared about my family, despite their treatment of him, and his genuine interest in David's happiness demonstrated a generosity of spirit that made their exclusion of him even more painful. That night, as we lay in bed discussing the day, Alex said something that would stay with me for years to come. "Jessica, I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. You've tried to include me and advocate for me in ways that I know have been difficult. But I think we need to accept that your family and I are going to have a limited relationship, and that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just how things are." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they represented a surrender that felt like a death. Alex was essentially giving up on the possibility of ever being fully accepted by my family and was asking me to accept that limitation as permanent rather than continue fighting for change that might never come. The wedding aftermath brought a series of conversations with family members who wanted to process the day's events and share their excitement about David's new marriage. But these conversations were complicated by the elephant in the room, Alex's absence and what it represented about our family's capacity for inclusion. Some relatives seemed genuinely confused about why Alex hadn't been invited, suggesting that the immediate family-only policy hadn't been clearly communicated or understood by everyone involved. Others made comments that revealed their relief about not having to navigate cultural differences during such an important celebration. My cousin Jennifer was the most direct in her assessment of the situation. "I think it was probably better this way," she said during a post-wedding phone call. David's wedding was about celebrating his relationship with Michelle, and having to worry about including everyone's spouses would have made things more complicated. Sometimes it's easier to keep things simple. Her comment crystallized the fundamental problem with my family's approach to Alex's membership. They had decided that including him was complicated rather than normal, that his presence required special accommodation rather than automatic inclusion. This framing allowed them to exclude him, while positioning that exclusion as reasonable and practical rather than discriminatory and hurtful. The Davids' wedding experience became a turning point in my understanding of my family's relationship with Alex and, by extension, with me. It wasn't just that they had excluded him from a single event. They had demonstrated that even after years of marriage, they still considered him an optional addition to our family, rather than an integral member whose absence would be noticed and regretted. More importantly, they had revealed that their comfort with familiar patterns was more important to them than his belonging or my happiness. They were willing to hurt both of us rather than stretch themselves to become more inclusive. And they had found ways to justify this choice that allowed them to maintain their self-image as loving and reasonable people. The wedding exclusion wasn't just about Alex. It was about the kind of family they were willing to be and the kind of future they were prepared to create. And for the first time, I began to understand that their limitations weren't temporary, obstacles to overcome but permanent boundaries that would define our relationships for years to come. 7 years later, I stood in the gleaming corridors of Millbrook Regional Medical Center, barely recognizing the small community hospital where I had been born 32 years earlier. The expansion and renovation project had transformed the modest facility into a state-of-the-art medical complex that served patients from 5 surrounding counties, complete with a new emergency department, cardiac care unit, and surgical suites that rivaled anything found in Des Moines or Iowa City. The changes weren't just architectural. Under the leadership of its new medical director, Dr. Alexander Chen, the hospital had recruited top specialists, implemented cutting-edge treatment protocols, and earned recognition as one of the premier healthcare facilities in rural Iowa. The boy my family had considered an outsider for so many years was now the person responsible for the medical care of everyone they knew and loved. Alex's transformation from excluded son-in-law to respected community leader hadn't happened overnight. After completing his residency in emergency medicine, he had accepted a position at Iowa Methodist Medical Center in Des Moines, where he quickly distinguished himself as both a skilled physician and a natural leader. Within 3 years, he had been promoted to Assistant Director of Emergency Services, and within 5 years, he was being recruited by hospitals across the Midwest. When the position at Millbrook Regional became available, Alex had initially dismissed it as too small for his growing expertise and ambitions. But the hospital board, led by my father who had joined as a community representative 2 years earlier, had crafted an offer that was impossible to refuse. They wanted Alex to completely restructure their emergency services department, recruit his own team of specialists, and essentially build a program that would serve as a model for rural healthcare delivery. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The same community that had struggled to accept Alex as a family member was now desperate to recruit him as their medical savior, offering him the kind of authority and respect that had been withheld from him in personal relationships. The hospital board meetings where my father advocated for Alex's hiring must have been fascinating exercises in cognitive dissonance as he argued for the professional qualifications of the same man he had excluded from family celebrations for years. Alex's decision to accept the position was motivated by more than professional opportunity. After years of living in larger cities where our intercultural marriage barely registered as noteworthy, he wanted to return to a community where his presence might make a difference in changing attitudes about diversity and inclusion. He also felt a responsibility to improve healthcare access for the kind of rural communities where he had been made to feel unwelcome, viewing his medical expertise as a tool for building bridges rather than just advancing his career. The community response to Alex's hiring had been overwhelmingly positive, though I suspected that much of the enthusiasm came from people who had never bothered to form opinions about him during our earlier years in Millbrook. Local newspaper. Articles celebrated the recruitment of such a distinguished physician, emphasizing his credentials from Northwestern Medical School and his experience at prestigious urban hospitals. The same cultural background that had once made him seem foreign now added to his appeal as someone who brought cosmopolitan expertise to rural Iowa. My father's role in Alex's recruitment created interesting dynamics at family gatherings. After years of treating Alex as a peripheral family member whose opinions and preferences could be safely ignored, Dad now spoke respectfully about his professional judgment and frequently quoted his insights about healthcare policy and medical ethics. The transformation wasn't complete. Alex remained somewhat separate from the easy familiarity that characterized relationships among longtime family members, but there was a new element of deference that had been entirely absent before. The hospital position also changed how other community members interacted with Alex, and, by extension, with me. People who had maintained polite distance during our earlier years in Millbrook now approached us with genuine warmth, eager to share their appreciation for the improvements Alex had brought to local healthcare. Parents whose children had been treated in the emergency department spoke about Alex with the kind of gratitude reserved for people who had literally saved their families, and their attitude toward our marriage shifted accordingly. The most significant change was in Alex himself. The careful diplomacy and measured responses that had characterized his interactions with my family during our early years had been replaced by quiet confidence and natural authority. He no longer needed to prove his worth or seek approval from people who had never bothered to understand his background or appreciate his contributions. His professional success had given him a platform for community leadership that transcended the personal relationships that had once defined his social status. At the same time, Alex's new position created interesting tensions within our marriage. For years, I had been his primary advocate and translator, helping him navigate social situations where his cultural background created barriers to full inclusion. Now, he was the one with power and influence, while I remained an elementary school teacher whose professional contributions, while meaningful, didn't carry the same community weight as emergency medicine. The role reversal was particularly apparent at social events, where Alex was sought out for his opinions on healthcare issues, economic development, and community planning, while I found myself identified primarily as Dr. Chen's wife, rather than as an individual with my own expertise and perspectives. This shift wasn't necessarily negative. I was proud of Alex's achievements and happy to see him receiving the recognition he deserved, but it required adjustments in how we navigated public spaces and social relationships. My family's response to Alex's new status was complex and revealing. They were genuinely proud to be connected to someone so accomplished and respected, and they enjoyed the reflected prestige that came from having a prominent physician in the family. At the same time, his success highlighted their previous treatment of him in ways that created discomfort and, occasionally, defensiveness. My mother began introducing Alex differently at social gatherings, emphasizing his medical credentials and community leadership role rather than simply identifying him as my husband. She developed a repertoire of stories about his professional achievements and community contributions that she shared with obvious pride, though these same stories implicitly acknowledged how little attention she had paid to his career development during our earlier years together. The shift was most apparent during family discussions about community issues. Healthcare access, economic development, and infrastructure planning had become frequent topics of conversation, and Alex's expertise made him a natural participant in these discussions. Family members who had once struggled to find common ground with him now sought his opinions and deferred to his judgment on matters related to his professional expertise. But these changes also revealed the superficial nature of much of the acceptance Alex was experiencing. His new status had earned him respect and attention, but it hadn't necessarily deepened the personal relationships or created the kind of emotional intimacy that characterized bonds among longtime family members. He remained somewhat separate from the casual teasing, shared memories, and inside jokes that marked the difference between polite inclusion and genuine belonging. The most telling example occurred during a family barbecue celebrating my nephew's high school graduation. Alex was engaged in serious conversation with my father and uncles about the economic impact of the hospital expansion, while my female relatives gathered around the kitchen island sharing gossip and planning upcoming family events. The physical separation mirrored the social dynamics that had always characterized his family relationships: respectful engagement with the men about professional topics, polite distance from the women's conversations about personal matters. When I pointed out this pattern to Alex later that evening, his response revealed how much his perspective had shifted over the years. "I don't need to be included in every family conversation," he said. "I'm satisfied with being respected for what I contribute professionally, even if the personal relationships remain limited. That's more acceptance than I ever expected to receive from your family." His comment highlighted both the progress we had made and the limitations that remained. Alex had earned a form of acceptance based on his professional achievements, but it was still conditional acceptance that depended on his continued usefulness rather than unconditional belonging based on his inherent worth as a family member. The hospital position also changed Alex's relationship with the broader community in ways that affected both of us. Patients and their families viewed him with the kind of deep gratitude reserved for people who had provided medical care during critical moments, and this relationship extended to their interactions with me as well. I was no longer just Jessica Clearwater, who had married someone from outside the community. I was the wife of Dr. Chen, who had saved their father's life or treated their child's emergency. This shift in community perception was gratifying, but also somewhat unsettling. After years of feeling like our marriage was viewed as an interesting social experiment that might or might not work out, we were now seen as a power couple whose cultural differences added to our appeal rather than creating barriers to acceptance. The same diversity that had once made us objects of polite curiosity now made us examples of successful integration and community leadership. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There remained family members and community members who maintained their distance, who viewed Alex's success as an exception rather than a reason to reconsider their attitudes about cultural differences. But the overall shift was significant enough to change the daily experience of living in Millbrook and participating in community life. Most importantly, Alex's professional success had given him a platform for demonstrating his values and capabilities that transcended the personal relationships where he had once sought acceptance. He no longer needed my family's approval to feel valued and respected in our community, and this independence had paradoxically made him more attractive to them, as someone worth knowing and including. The years of exclusion and careful boundary maintenance had taught Alex to be self-sufficient in ways that made him less dependent on others for validation or belonging. His professional achievements had created their own network of relationships and community connections that didn't require mediation through family dynamics or cultural translation. By the time Alex had established himself as an essential community leader, the question of his belonging in Millbrook had been answered definitively. He wasn't just accepted, he was needed, valued, and respected by people whose opinions mattered, in ways that extended far beyond family relationships. The transformation from excluded outsider to indispensable community member had taken 7 years to complete, but it had fundamentally changed the dynamics of power and acceptance that would define our future relationships with both family and community. The call came at 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in late September, jolting me awake with the sharp insistence that only emergency calls carry. Alex was already reaching for his phone, his body trained by years of medical practice to respond immediately to nighttime interruptions. In the darkness of our bedroom, I could hear the tension in his voice as he answered. "Dr. Chen speaking." I lay still, listening to one side of a conversation that I could tell was serious from Alex's increasingly focused tone and the rapid-fire medical questions he was asking. After several minutes, he hung up and was already moving toward his closet, pulling on the clothes he kept ready for emergency calls. "What is it?" I asked, though I could already sense that this wasn't a routine hospital emergency. "Your father," Alex said, his voice carefully controlled in the way it became when he was switching into full professional mode. "He collapsed during the town council meeting. They're bringing him in now with what sounds like cardiac symptoms." The words hit me like cold water, instantly washing away any lingering drowsiness and replacing it with the sharp clarity that comes with genuine crisis. My father, who at 63 still maintained the physical vigor of someone 20 years younger, who had never missed a day of work due to illness, who prided himself on his strength and self-reliance, was being rushed to the hospital where my husband worked as the head of emergency services. "How bad is it?" I asked, already getting out of bed and reaching for clothes. "I won't know until I examine him," Alex replied, but his tone told me more than his words. This wasn't a minor health scare or a false alarm. This was the kind of emergency that required immediate professional attention and could result in life-altering consequences. 20 minutes later, I was driving through the empty streets of Millbrook toward the hospital, my mind racing with worry about my father's condition and awareness of the strange irony that was about to unfold. For years, my family had treated Alex as someone whose medical expertise was intellectually impressive, but not personally relevant to their lives. Now, in the most frightening moment any of us had faced, Alex was the person whose skills and judgment would determine my father's survival. The hospital's emergency entrance was brilliantly lit against the dark sky, creating an island of urgent activity in the quiet rural night. I parked quickly and hurried through the automatic doors into the familiar controlled chaos of emergency medicine, monitors beeping, staff moving with practiced efficiency, and the underlying tension that marked serious medical situations. I found my mother in the waiting area, still wearing the dress she had put on for the town council meeting that had been interrupted by my father's collapse. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by fear and uncertainty in a way that made her seem suddenly vulnerable and older. My brother David was with her, along with my Aunt Linda and several family friends who had followed the ambulance from the council meeting. "Jessica," my mother said when she saw me, reaching out with hands that shook slightly. "Thank God you're here. They won't tell us anything yet. The doctor is still with him." The doctor she was referring to was Alex, though she hadn't made that connection yet. In her fear and confusion, she was thinking of him as the emergency doctor, rather than as the son-in-law whose presence at family gatherings had always been carefully managed and whose medical opinions had never been sought for any family health concerns. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down next to her and taking her trembling hands in mine. "He was giving his report about the hospital expansion project," David explained, his voice tight with worry. "He seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but he'd been working long hours on the proposal. Then he just stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, put his hand on his chest, and collapsed." The details painted a picture of sudden cardiac event, the kind of medical emergency that could happen to anyone, but that was always devastating when it happened to someone you loved. I thought about my father as I had seen him just days earlier, confident, energetic, fully engaged in the community leadership role that had defined much of his identity since retirement from farming. "How long has he been here?" I asked. "About 40 minutes, my Aunt Linda replied. "The ambulance got here quickly and they took him straight back, but no one has come out to tell us anything yet." The waiting was terrible in the way that only medical emergencies can be. Time moving both too slowly and too quickly, every minute feeling like an hour while simultaneously rushing toward unknown outcomes. I found myself studying my mother's face, noting the deep lines of worry and the way her usual composure had been stripped away by circumstances beyond her control. It was during this agonizing waiting period that my mother finally asked the question that would change everything. "About our family dynamics, Jessica," she said quietly. "Alex works here now, doesn't he? Do you think he might know what's happening with your father?" The question revealed how completely my family had compartmentalized Alex's professional life from his personal relationship with them. My mother was asking if Alex might have information about my father's condition, apparently not realizing that as the head of emergency services, Alex was almost certainly the doctor treating him. "Mom," I said gently, "Alex isn't just working here tonight. He's the emergency department director. He's probably the doctor who's taking care of Dad right now." The expression that crossed my mother's face was complex: surprise, realization, and something that might have been hope mixed with uncertainty. For 7 years, she had managed to avoid thinking of Alex as someone whose expertise might be directly relevant to our family's well-being. Now, in the most frightening moment of her life, she was suddenly dependent on the skills and judgment of the man she had never quite accepted as a full family member. "But that's good, isn't it?" she asked, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "I mean, Alex is a very good doctor, right?" The question revealed the strange liminal space Alex had occupied in my family's consciousness. They had acknowledged his professional accomplishments in abstract terms, but they had never considered him as someone whose medical expertise might be personally important to them. Now they were forced to confront the reality that their family member's life was in the hands of the man they had spent years treating as a polite outsider. David's response was more direct. "Jesus, Jess, I didn't even think about that. Alex is Dad's doctor right now. That's either really good luck or really weird coincidence." "It's not coincidence," I replied. "Alex is the head of emergency services. Any serious cardiac emergency that comes through those doors is going to be his responsibility." As the implications of this situation began to settle over my family, I could see them processing the strange reversal of power and dependency that had just occurred. The man whose opinions they had never sought, whose cultural background they had treated as irrelevant to their family concerns, and whose presence at family gatherings they had carefully managed, was now the person responsible for making life or death decisions about my father's care. The waiting room conversation became subdued as everyone absorbed this reality. Family friends who had known Alex peripherally through community events were suddenly asking detailed questions about his medical training and experience. Relatives who had maintained polite distance during social gatherings were now expressing gratitude that someone so qualified was available to provide care. My mother's transformation was the most dramatic. The woman who had spent years worrying about whether Alex really fit with our family traditions was now hanging on every word I could share about his medical credentials and expertise. She wanted to know about his residency training, his experience with cardiac emergencies, and his reputation among other medical professionals. "Is he really as good as people say he is?" she asked, and I could hear the desperate hope in her voice. "He's one of the best emergency physicians in the state," I replied, and for the first time in our relationship, my mother seemed genuinely interested in hearing details about Alex's professional achievements. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on any of us, but the immediate crisis overshadowed any awkwardness about past family dynamics. Fear for my father's life had temporarily suspended the careful social boundaries that had previously defined Alex's relationship with my family, creating a moment where his value was measured entirely by his ability to save someone they loved. 45 minutes after my arrival, Alex emerged from the emergency department, still wearing scrubs and looking serious, but not devastated. His expression was the carefully controlled demeanor that medical professionals use when delivering important information to families, calm, authoritative, and designed to convey competence without revealing premature conclusions. My mother stood up immediately when she saw him, her body language conveying both desperate hope and newfound respect for his authority in this situation. For the first time in the 7 years of our marriage, she was looking at Alex not as my husband or as a peripheral family member, but as the doctor who held my father's life in his hands. "Mrs. Clearwater," Alex said, using the formal address that maintained professional boundaries while acknowledging the personal relationship. "I need to talk with the family about your husband's condition." The room fell silent as everyone gathered around Alex, waiting to hear news that would determine whether this night would be remembered as a medical scare or a family tragedy. In that moment, Alex held more power over my family's future than anyone else in the room, and I could see that reality registering in their faces as they prepared to hear his professional judgment about my father's chances of survival. Alex's demeanor as he addressed our family was everything I had learned to recognize as his professional mode: calm, authoritative, and carefully measured in a way that conveyed both competence and compassion. He had guided families through medical crises countless times before, but never while navigating the complex personal dynamics that made this situation unlike any other emergency he had handled. "Your husband has suffered what we call a massive myocardial infarction," Alex began, using the clinical terminology that established his medical authority while speaking clearly enough for non-medical family members to understand. "In simpler terms, he's had a major heart attack that has caused significant damage to his cardiac muscle." My mother's face went pale, and I could see her struggling to process information that was both terrifying and technical. David moved closer to her, providing physical support while Alex continued his explanation. "The good news is that we were able to stabilize his condition and restore normal heart rhythm," Alex continued. "The paramedics did excellent work getting him here quickly, and we were able to begin treatment within the optimal time window for this type of emergency." The relief in the room was palpable, but Alex's expression indicated that he wasn't finished delivering difficult news. "However," he said, and the single word caused everyone to tense again, "the damage to his heart is extensive. He's going to need immediate surgical intervention to restore blood flow to the affected areas and prevent further complications." My Aunt Linda, who had remained silent throughout Alex's explanation, finally spoke up. "What kind of surgery? And how dangerous is it?" Alex's response revealed both his medical expertise and his understanding of how to communicate complex information to frightened families. "He needs what's called coronary artery bypass surgery," he explained. "We'll take healthy blood vessels from other parts of his body and use them to create new pathways around the blocked arteries in his heart. It's a serious procedure, but it's also the standard treatment for this type of damage, and we have excellent success rates." "Can you do the surgery?" my mother asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice that Alex would personally handle every aspect of my father's care. "I'm an emergency physician, not a cardiac surgeon," Alex replied. "But I can tell you that Dr. Sarah Martinez, who will be performing the surgery, is one of the best cardiac surgeons in the Midwest. She's done hundreds of these procedures, and I would trust her with my own family's care." Or the distinction between Alex's role and the surgeon's role seemed to confuse my mother, who was struggling to understand why the doctor who had saved my father's life couldn't continue to provide all his treatment. "But you'll still be involved in his care?" she asked, and I could hear the anxiety in her voice at the thought of losing Alex's oversight. "I'll be monitoring his condition throughout his stay," Alex assured her. "Emergency physicians often coordinate care for complex cases like this, making sure all the specialists are communicating and that his treatment plan remains consistent." The conversation revealed how completely my family's perception of Alex had shifted in the space of a few hours. The man whose medical opinions had never been sought for even minor family health concerns was now being viewed as their primary advocate and protector in navigating a life-threatening medical crisis. David asked the question that everyone was thinking, "What are Dad's chances?" Alex's response demonstrated the careful balance that medical professionals must maintain between honesty and hope. "Cardiac bypass surgery has very good success rates, especially when we can perform it quickly after the initial event," he said. "Your father is relatively young, he's been in good physical condition, and he doesn't have other health complications that would increase surgical risk. I would estimate his chances of full recovery at better than 90%. The collective exhale from our family was audible, but Alex wasn't finished providing important information. "However," Alex continued, his voice maintaining the same professional calm while delivering information that would reshape our family's understanding of the situation, Recovery from this type of surgery isn't just about surviving the procedure. Your father is going to need significant lifestyle changes, ongoing medical management, and a strong support system to prevent future cardiac events. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. My family was beginning to understand that my father's heart attack wasn't just a single emergency to overcome, it was the beginning of a long-term health management process that would require expertise, coordination, and ongoing professional oversight. My mother's voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "What kind of lifestyle changes?" Alex's response was thorough and compassionate, but it painted a picture of fundamental alterations to the way my father had always lived his life. Diet modification will be essential, significantly reducing sodium, saturated fats, and processed foods. Regular exercise, but carefully monitored and gradually increased. Stress management will be crucial, which may mean reducing work responsibilities, and finding healthier ways to handle the community commitments that have been so important to him. Each item on Alex's list represented a challenge to my father's established patterns and preferences. He had always eaten whatever he wanted, worked as much as he felt necessary, and taken pride in his ability to handle multiple responsibilities without apparent strain. The heart attack had revealed that this approach was no longer sustainable. He'll also need regular cardiac monitoring, medication management, and coordination between multiple specialists, Alex continued. This isn't the kind of health situation that can be handled with occasional checkups with a family doctor. He's going to need a comprehensive cardiac care team. My brother David asked the practical question that was on everyone's mind. What does that mean for someone living in Millbrook? We don't have cardiac specialists here. Alex's answer revealed one of the most significant implications of my father's condition. Normally, patients with this type of cardiac damage need to relocate closer to a major medical center or travel frequently for specialized care, he said. But because I'm here, and because we've built relationships with cardiac specialists in Des Moines and Iowa City, we can coordinate much of his ongoing care locally while ensuring he has access to the specialized services he'll need. The meaning behind Alex's words was unmistakable. My father's ability to continue living in Millbrook, maintaining his community connections, and recovering in familiar surroundings was directly dependent on Alex's presence and professional relationships. The man my family had treated as an optional addition to their lives had become essential to preserving the life my father had built in this community. My mother's response revealed how completely this reality had shifted her perspective on Alex's importance to our family. "So you would be managing his care?" she asked, and there was something almost like relief in her voice at the prospect of having Alex's oversight for my father's recovery. "I would be coordinating his care team and monitoring his progress," Alex confirmed. Emergency physicians often serve in this role for complex cardiac patients, especially in smaller communities where we have relationships with specialists in larger cities. The conversation that followed revealed layers of decision-making that no one had anticipated. When we first arrived at the hospital, my father's survival wasn't just about successful surgery. It was about creating a long-term care plan that would require trust, communication, and ongoing collaboration between Alex and our family in ways that had never existed before. My aunt, Linda, who had always been the most practical member of our family, asked the question that forced everyone to confront the changed dynamics explicitly. "Alex, I know this is awkward given the family relationships, but I need to ask directly. Are you comfortable taking on this level of responsibility for Robert's care? And are we prepared as a family to work with you in whatever way his recovery requires?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone to acknowledge that the medical crisis had created a situation where past family dynamics could no longer be maintained. Alex's answer would determine not just my father's care plan, but the future of his relationship with my entire family. Alex took a moment before responding, and I could see him considering not just the medical aspects of the question, but the personal and family implications as well. From a medical standpoint, I'm absolutely prepared to coordinate Robert's care, he said. I have the expertise, the professional relationships, and the authority within this hospital system to ensure he receives optimal treatment. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a different quality, more personal, less clinical. From a family standpoint, I think we all need to acknowledge that this situation is going to require a different kind of relationship than we've had in the past. Robert's recovery will depend on open communication, trust in medical recommendations, and cooperation with treatment plans that may be challenging or uncomfortable. Alex's diplomatic phrasing concealed what everyone in the room understood. Successful treatment would require my family to trust Alex's judgment, follow his recommendations, and accept his authority in ways that had been unthinkable just hours earlier. My mother's response surprised everyone, including myself. "Alex," she said, and for the first time in our 7-year marriage, she used his name without the careful formality that had always marked their interactions. "I want you to know that Robert's care is the most important thing to all of us right now. Whatever has happened in the past, whatever mistakes we might have made in how we've treated you, none of that matters compared to giving Robert the best possible chance of recovery." The admission was remarkable not just for its content, but for its public nature. My mother had essentially acknowledged, in front of extended family and friends, that their treatment of Alex had been inadequate, and that circumstances now required a fundamental change in their relationship. "I don't know anything about medicine," she continued, "but I know that you've saved Robert's life tonight, and I know that you're the person best qualified to help him recover. So I'm asking you, as a mother who loves her family, to please take care of my husband." The formality of her request, combined with its emotional honesty, created a moment of recognition that transcended years of careful social boundaries and polite distance. My mother was essentially surrendering control over my father's care to the man she had never quite accepted as a full family member, and she was doing so publicly and without reservation. Alex's response was both professional and gracious. "I will provide the best possible care for Robert," he said, "and I'll make sure he has access to every resource and specialist he needs for optimal recovery. But I also want to be clear that this kind of comprehensive cardiac care requires family support and cooperation that goes beyond medical appointments and medication compliance." "What do you mean?" David asked. Alex's explanation revealed the extent to which my father's recovery would reshape our family dynamics. Robert is going to need help with diet changes, exercise programs, stress management, and lifestyle modifications that will affect everyone around him. Family meals, social activities, work commitments, and daily routines are all going to need adjustment. This isn't just about medical treatment. It's about creating an environment that supports cardiac health and prevents future complications. The implications of Alex's words were significant. My father's recovery would require my family to accept Alex not just as a medical authority, but as someone whose recommendations would influence their daily lives, social activities, and long-term planning. More importantly, Alex continued, cardiac recovery often involves emotional and psychological challenges that require strong family support. Robert is going to need encouragement, patience, and understanding as he adjusts to limitations and changes that may be difficult for someone who has always been very independent and active. My grandmother, who had been silent throughout most of the medical discussion, finally spoke up. "Alex," she said, using his name naturally for the first time I could remember, "what do you need from us to help Robert get better?" Her question was simple, direct, and completely focused on practical outcomes rather than social dynamics or family politics. It represented a fundamental shift in how she was approaching her relationship with Alex, as a resource to be utilized rather than an outsider to be managed. Alex's response outlined a care plan that would require unprecedented cooperation and communication between him and our family. First, I need everyone to understand that cardiac recovery is a long-term process that requires consistency and patience. Robert will have good days and difficult days, and his mood and energy levels may fluctuate significantly during the first few months. Second, dietary changes are going to affect family meals and social gatherings. We'll need to work together to create food options that support his heart health, while still allowing him to enjoy eating and sharing meals with people he loves. Third, exercise and activity levels will need to be carefully monitored and gradually increased. He'll need encouragement to stay active while also respecting the limitations that will keep him safe. Finally, stress management is crucial for cardiac recovery. Family conflicts, work pressures, and social obligations that create anxiety or tension can literally threaten his physical recovery. The last point carried obvious implications for our family dynamics. Alex was essentially saying that the kind of careful social boundaries and polite tensions that had characterized his relationship with my family for years could now pose a direct threat to my father's health. My mother's response indicated that she understood the message clearly. So what you're saying is that we need to find ways to work together as a family without creating stress or conflict that might affect Robert's recovery. Exactly, Alex D. Confirmed. Cardiac patients do better when they feel supported by family relationships that are genuine and comfortable rather than formal or strained. The conversation had evolved into something that felt like family therapy disguised as medical planning, with Alex serving as both the expert authority and the family member whose inclusion was being negotiated. The medical crisis had created an opportunity for addressing relationship dynamics that had been carefully avoided for years. David summarized the situation with characteristic directness. So basically, Dad's recovery is going to require all of us to figure out how to be a real family that includes Alex completely, rather than the polite version we've been doing where we include him sometimes when it's convenient. That's a very accurate assessment, Alex replied, and I could detect the slightest hint of amusement in his voice at David's blunt characterization of our family dynamics. The medical emergency had created what family therapists call a therapeutic crisis, a situation where established patterns become impossible to maintain and change becomes necessary for survival. My father's heart attack had forced my family to choose between preserving their comfortable social boundaries and accepting the full inclusion that Alex's medical expertise required. The choice, when framed in terms of my father's survival and recovery, wasn't really a choice at all. But acknowledging that reality required my family to admit that their previous treatment of Alex had been inadequate and that their comfort with exclusion had come at a significant cost. As the immediate medical crisis stabilized and surgical plans were finalized, the broader implications of this moment began to settle over all of us. My father's heart attack had revealed not just his physical vulnerability, but our family's emotional limitations, and recovery would require healing on both levels. The cardiac surgery took 6 hours, during which time our family waiting room became an impromptu gathering place for what felt like half of Millbrook. Word had spread quickly through the community networks that had been my father's primary source of identity and influence for decades, and people arrived throughout the day to offer support, share memories, and demonstrate the deep connections he had built over a lifetime of community involvement. Alex appeared periodically during the surgery to provide updates on my father's progress, and I watched my family's interactions with him evolve in real time as the day progressed. Each update was delivered with the same professional competence and compassionate clarity that had marked his initial explanation, but the family's reception of these updates revealed how fundamentally their perception of him was shifting. My mother, who had spent years politely acknowledging Alex's professional achievements without expressing genuine interest in his work, now hung on every word of his medical explanations and asked detailed follow-up questions that demonstrated both her growing trust in his expertise and her desperate need for reassurance about my father's condition. "Is 6 hours normal for this type of surgery?" she asked during his third update. "It's within the expected range," Alex replied. Dr. Martinez is being very thorough in ensuring that all the bypass grafts are positioned optimally. Taking extra time during surgery often results in better long-term outcomes. My Aunt Linda, who had always maintained careful emotional distance from Alex, approached him directly during one of his appearances in the waiting room. "Alex," she said, "I want to thank you for everything you're doing for Robert. I know this situation is complicated because of family relationships, but I need you to know how grateful we all are that you were here when this happened." Her acknowledgement was significant, not just because she was expressing gratitude, but because she was publicly recognizing the complicated nature of Alex's relationship with our family, while simultaneously affirming his value and importance to us. The community members who gathered throughout the day created an interesting backdrop for observing these changed family dynamics. Many of them knew Alex professionally through his work at the hospital, and their interactions with him revealed a level of respect and appreciation that my family was witnessing for the first time. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught Sunday school to most of the adults in the room, approached Alex with the kind of warmth usually reserved for longtime community. "Pillars. Dr. Chen," she said, "I can't tell you how much comfort it gives all of us to know that Robert is receiving care from someone with your expertise. The whole community feels so fortunate to have you at our hospital." Her comment was delivered in front of my entire family, providing external validation of Alex's professional reputation and community standing that carried more weight than any private conversation could have achieved. Dr. Martinez emerged from surgery in the late afternoon, still wearing scrubs and looking tired but satisfied. Her report to our family was overwhelmingly positive. The surgery had been successful, all blocked arteries had been bypassed, and my father's heart function had already begun to improve during the procedure. Dr. Chen's quick diagnosis and treatment in the emergency department made a significant difference in today's outcome, she told our family. The rapid response and stabilization he provided gave us the best possible conditions for successful surgery. Her professional assessment, delivered to a room full of family and community members, positioned Alex as the hero of my father's survival story, rather than simply one member of a medical team. The cardiac surgeon, whose opinion carried ultimate authority in this situation, was publicly crediting Alex with saving my father's life. My mother's response to Dr. Martinez's report revealed how completely her perspective on Alex had transformed. "Dr. Chen is my son-in-law," she told Dr. Martinez with obvious pride, using a family designation that had previously been offered reluctantly and with qualification. "We're so grateful that he was here to take care of Robert." The simple statement represented a fundamental shift in how my mother was positioning Alex within our family narrative. Instead of describing him as Jessica's husband who happened to work at the hospital, she was claiming him as a family member whose presence had been providential for my father's survival. As the evening progressed and my father's condition stabilized, in the cardiac intensive care unit, Alex took time to sit with our family and explain the recovery process in detail. His explanation was thorough, patient, and delivered with the kind of personal investment that went beyond professional duty. "The next 72 hours are critical for monitoring potential complications," he explained. "After that, if everything progresses normally, we'll begin the rehabilitation process that will determine his long-term recovery." "What does rehabilitation involve?" David asked. Alex's response outlined a comprehensive program that would require months of coordinated care, family support, and lifestyle modifications that would affect everyone in my father's social circle. Physical therapy to rebuild strength and endurance, occupational therapy to help him adapt daily activities to his cardiac limitations, nutritional counseling to establish heart-healthy eating patterns, and psychological support to help him adjust to the lifestyle changes that will be necessary for preventing future cardiac events. "How long will all of this take?" my grandmother asked. "Full cardiac recovery typically takes 6 to 12 months, Alex replied. "But the lifestyle changes we implement during recovery need to become permanent habits. This isn't about getting back to exactly how things were before. It's about creating a new normal that supports long-term heart health. The conversation that followed revealed how my father's recovery would reshape not just his individual life, but our entire family's social patterns and traditions. Holiday meals would need menu modifications, family gatherings would need to accommodate exercise schedules and energy limitations, and long-term planning would need to include regular medical appointments and ongoing health monitoring. My mother's questions during this discussion revealed her growing reliance on Alex's guidance and her acceptance of his authority in matters that extended far beyond immediate medical care. "What about his involvement in community organizations?" she asked. "He's been so committed to the hospital board and the town council, and I know those responsibilities are important to him." Alex's response demonstrated both medical expertise and understanding of my father's psychological needs. Community involvement can actually be beneficial for cardiac recovery, as long as it doesn't create excessive stress or interfere with other aspects of his health management. We'll need to monitor his energy levels and help him find ways to stay engaged without becoming overwhelmed. "But you'll help us figure out what's appropriate and what might be too much?" my mother asked. And her question revealed how completely she was prepared to defer to Alex's judgment about my father's future activities and commitments. "Absolutely," Alex replied. "Managing cardiac recovery requires ongoing assessment and adjustment. What works in the first month might need to change by the third month as his strength improves and his confidence builds." The late evening hours in the hospital waiting room created an intimate atmosphere where conversations became more personal and honest than any interaction Alex had experienced with my family during our entire marriage. The medical crisis had suspended normal social boundaries and created space for discussions that addressed both practical concerns and emotional needs. My grandmother, who had always been the family's emotional anchor, used this opportunity to address directly the changed dynamics that my father's condition had created. "Alex," she said, "I want you to know that having you involved in Robert's care gives me more peace of mind than anything else about this whole situation. I trust you completely to make the right decisions for his health." Her statement was remarkable, not just for its expression of trust, but for its acknowledgement that Alex's judgment was now central to our family's most important concerns. The woman who had previously treated him as a peripheral family member was now positioning him as someone whose opinions and decisions would determine our family's future well-being. "I also want to apologize," she continued, "for the ways we might have made you feel less than completely welcome in our family over the years. Today has made me realize how foolish we've been to keep someone at arm's length who has so much to offer our family." The apology was delivered in front of multiple family members and community friends, making it a public acknowledgement of past treatment that couldn't be minimized or forgotten. My grandmother was essentially admitting that their exclusion of Alex had been based on prejudice rather than legitimate concerns about his character or capabilities. Alex's response was gracious and forward-looking. "What matters now is Robert's recovery and our ability to work together as a family to support him through this process," he said. "The past is less important than the future we're going to create together." His diplomatic response avoided assigning blame while affirming his commitment to building better family relationships going forward. But the significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. My family had been forced to confront their treatment of Alex and had chosen to prioritize his inclusion over their previous comfort with exclusion. As the first day after my father's heart attack drew to a close, the transformation in my family's relationship with Alex was already apparent in dozens of small interactions. They sought his opinion on medical questions, deferred to his recommendations about visiting schedules, and included him naturally in discussions about family planning and logistics in ways that had never occurred before. The medical crisis had created what psychologists call a critical incident, a moment that reveals true character and forces fundamental choices about values and priorities. My family had been forced to choose between preserving their comfortable social boundaries and accepting the full inclusion that Alex's expertise required for my father's survival. They had chosen inclusion, not just as a temporary accommodation to a medical emergency, but as a recognition that their previous exclusion had been based on prejudice rather than practical concerns. The heart attack had revealed not just my father's physical vulnerability, but our family's emotional limitations and recovery would require healing on both levels. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these. Just click and check them out.